So our last speaker is Dr. Debra Hendrickson, who will present A Burning House, Children's Health in the Warming World. After graduating with honors in environmental studies from Brown University, Dr. Hendrickson served with the Peace Corps in Ecuador. She was an environmental analyst for 10 years before attending medical school. She is currently an associate clinical professor at the University of Nevada School of Medicine and practices in Reno, Nevada. Dr. Hendrickson is a member of the AAP Council on Environmental Health and is writing a book on the impacts of climate change on children. Please welcome Dr. Hendrickson.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming today. I want to start off telling you a little about the drawing that I've shown a piece of here in my title slide. It was done by a 5-year-old who I met in Santa Rosa, California, just a few months after her home had burned down in the 2017 wine country fires. She and her mother and brother had to flee in the middle of the night through a firestorm that leveled their entire neighborhood and killed more than 20 people, including one of their close neighbors. And she drew this picture and showed it to me, and she explained, here's the fire with the flames. Here's how it is now, all ashes and black. But here's how it will be. And she pointed at the flowers and blue sky and a rainbow. And I asked her, what's this bright green part at the bottom? And she said, oh, that's the way things used to be. I wanted to start with this because I think when we talk about the climate crisis, it can be so hard to do what this little girl did. Be clear-eyed about the situation we are in and what has already, almost certainly, been lost. Yet still see the possibility of the future. And in our case, as adults, the power we have to shape it. I met her in the course of writing a book with this same title about the impact that the climate crisis is already having on children's health in the United States. As you heard, I'm a pediatrician in Reno, Nevada, but I have a background in environmental science and forestry, which probably affected how I saw the events unfolding in my town. Reno normally looks like this. That's downtown. My clinic and hospital are off to the left. Those are the Sierra Nevada mountains with Lake Tahoe and California over that ridge. But in recent years, like many cities in the West, we've had more and more weeks that look like this. Because we're just a few miles east of California, many of its wildfires lead to smoke crises for us. With this week's headlines, I hardly have to tell you how bad this has been. But in 2017, the year that little girl's house burned down, California recorded more than 9,000 wildfires. The idea for the book came to me several years ago when this little girl visited my clinic during one of the first and worst smoke crises that we had. It was caused by the enormous rim fire in and near Yosemite National Park in 2013. She had a history of asthma, and despite nebulizer treatments at home, was having more and more trouble breathing, as a lot of people were. So Mom covered her car seat with a damp baby blanket as a barrier to the smoke and brought her into the clinic. And I had my stethoscope on her chest, listening to her wheeze, when I looked up at the exam room window and saw ash and cinders raining from the sky, swirling around the building like ghosts. It was like an episode of The Twilight Zone, where the world outside was transformed into something surreal and dark, and you could barely make out the building next door. And I looked back at Anna, who was sitting on the exam table watching me with those big brown eyes, and I suddenly had this moment, and I suspect some of you have had one like it in recent years, because I could see that this one baby's struggle to breathe was connected to and symbolic of this much bigger story of what was happening in the world, that she was paying the price with her health for decisions made by powerful people who would never meet her or see the impact of what they were doing. Right about then, her mother looked out the window too at this apocalyptic and frankly frightening scene and said to me, "Isn't it funny how you never think about breathing until you can't?" This is an aerial picture of the rim fire burning here at the bottom with smoke flowing northeast toward Reno. This was taken on the day Anna came to my clinic, so she and her mother and I were somewhere in this cloud. And Anna, a baby with asthma, had to breathe this polluted air for over 2 weeks. After they left my clinic, I just kept thinking about what her mother had said and how those little struggling lungs I had listened to were connected physically to these forests that were burning upwind. That she was inhaling the vaporized remnants of those trees, which scientists had told us were dying by the hundreds of millions from Canada to Mexico because of climate change. That both her fate and the fate of those forests, which I had studied in my prior career, were part of the same fabric, and that this fabric to which we all belong was unraveling. Within the next couple of years, it became obvious that wildfire smoke was not the only way she and our other patients were being affected. I'm going to show you the faces and briefly tell the stories today of children harmed by intensifying wildfires, hurricanes, and heat waves. I'm going to focus on why children are particularly vulnerable in these disasters. But there's so much more to say than what I can cover here. The ozone in urban smog is increasing because warmer temperatures cause more of it to form. Allergens like ragweed and mold are rising dramatically, and pollen itself is becoming more potent. We're seeing shifts in vector-borne diseases carried by rising populations of ticks and mosquitoes. Food and water insecurity in many parts of the world is leading to violence, conflict, and migration crises. Everywhere, children who are old enough to understand these things feel increasing anxiety and depression, and sometimes a new form of distress known as climate grief. Many times, while caring for patients impacted by one of these problems, it's occurred to me that while we think of climate change as a global crisis, it's actually a very personal crisis, multiplied many times. It's a crisis for those we love most and promise to keep safe. The World Health Organization estimates that 88% of the health burden of climate change is falling on those under 5 years of age. We, as pediatricians, are caring for the generation most impacted by this crisis and are on the front lines of seeing its individual effects. We have stories to tell, and those stories are critical to getting people to act. Telling these stories and using them to explain the health impacts of climate change on children was what I set out to do in the book. But in doing that, I also wanted to frame a different way of thinking about children's bodies in the world and how they are linked to the atmosphere. Because I realized Anna's mother was right. We take for granted what we shouldn't. The only reason we are here at all is our ability to breathe, which we owe to this thin band of gases that lies over Earth's surface, our atmosphere. The act of breathing, from a baby's first cry to her last, the act that all of us are doing right now, pulls the atmosphere into our bodies, through our airways, into our blood. We could not be more physically linked to this unseen fabric around us. But not only through our lungs, our heart and skin and sweat glands work together to maintain a constant inner temperature in the conditions this atmosphere has always provided. Our brains and even our genes are molded by the environment. When we hold a newborn baby for the first time, that little body represents millions of years of genetic inheritance of living on this particular planet in this particular atmosphere. And yet, while we are so physically connected to this world, we are, even now, with everything science tells us, deeply psychologically disconnected from what we are doing to it. Few of us think, as we drive to the hospital to see that newborn baby, that our car exhaust is going to leave a mark on the atmosphere for the rest of that baby's life. That we are speeding up, ever so minutely, the end of that child's world. Because the carbon dioxide in our exhaust will stay in the atmosphere for anywhere from decades to eons, accumulating, trapping more and more heat. You can see here that our emissions of CO2 have radically altered its concentration in the atmosphere and continue to climb, reaching their highest level ever in 2018, 40 years after Exxon's own scientists warned the company of the danger. The curves for methane and other greenhouse gases are very similar. If we just take the end part of this curve and look at the temperature trends over the same period, you can see that the impact on world temperatures is an increase of about 1 degree centigrade so far, with the last 5-year period being the hottest ever recorded on Earth. But what a deeply ironic time this is for our profession. Because think about it, at the time that the world started this upward climb, in the mid-19th century when the industrial age really began, the infant mortality rate, the percentage of babies dying before their first birthday, was 1 in 5. In 1853, half of all the deaths in New York City were children 5 and under. Now the infant mortality rate has dropped to about 1 in 100. In so many ways, as you've heard this morning, for children in the United States, it's the best of times, right? Breathtaking medical advances, many of which you've heard about at this conference, are saving children from countless threats. Through vaccines, water treatment plants, and now genetic engineering, life-saving surgeries, treatments for cancer, and technologies like the insulin pump and MRI, we've dramatically improved most children's lives and survival. But we need to look up from our successes and see the bigger picture. Because as we accomplish these miracles, our children are facing a health threat unlike any seen by prior generations. The evidence of it is emerging all around us, most dramatically in the growing number and intensity of wildfires, hurricanes, floods, and heat waves. And of course, children throughout history have had to cope with disaster and war and illness and famine. But they have never before had to face, in quite this way, the possible end of the future itself. Because all we have to do for their world to end is nothing. Just keep doing what we're doing. If that is our choice, everything we've accomplished since the 19th century is at risk, and everything else we do for children's health could become moot. But I would like to argue that all the accomplishments of pediatrics are evidence of what can be done, that they should inspire us to confront this crisis too and realize what is possible when we devote ourselves as a society to children's welfare and fight for their future. We in this room know that children are uniquely vulnerable to these environmental threats, because over the last several decades, we've learned more and more that their bodies and minds, even how their genes are expressed, develop through interaction with the world. Again, they exist within a fabric of air, temperature, other living things, and human beings they love. The climate crisis represents a disruption of that fabric and will literally shape their physical and mental health. Which brings us back to Anna. During the rim fire, Anna was more vulnerable to the smoke than her mother or me for several reasons. First, because her lungs were still developing. 80% of lung growth happens after birth through the formation of hundreds of millions of alveoli from the terminal saccules and by the lungs simply getting larger. But this process, it turns out, is affected by the quality of air kids breathe. We know from long-term studies of kids in Southern California that exposure to fine particles, the microscopic ash and droplets found in extremely high levels in wildfire smoke, significantly stunts lung function. Ground level ozone, which as I mentioned is also increasing due to climate change, does the same. These pollutants also damage respiratory tract epithelium and the development of lung immunity, which increases a child's odds of asthma, pneumonia, and bronchitis. In the years since the rim fire, Anna has had recurrent episodes of all these things, which we know are more likely in chronically exposed children. But it wasn't just her lungs that were at risk in the smoke. The brain, too, does most of its development in early life, and there's growing evidence that childhood exposure to fine particles and ozone, again, pollutants increasing because of climate change, harms the formation of key regions of the brain. In fact, inhaled particles have been found embedded in the brains of children living in highly polluted cities. This is an MRI of a 10-year-old boy from Mexico City. The arrows indicate the author's theories about how air pollutants had entered and irritated these regions of his brain. Such exposure has been associated with higher levels of attention, learning, and behavior problems, as well as autism. So when parents bring up their fears about autism and vaccines, I often use that as an opportunity to say, you know what? There's no evidence of a link with vaccines, but let me tell you about wildfire smoke and climate change and diesel trucks, because it's worth pointing out that even if fossil fuels weren't destroying the planet, their emissions cause these problems, which is why some have called addressing climate change and getting off those fuels the greatest health opportunity of the 21st century. So Anna's still forming lungs and brain were part of the reason she was more at risk during the fire. But there are other reasons children are more vulnerable. This is my 4-year-old patient, Liam, who was hospitalized in the summer of 2018 for wheezing and hypoxemia after he snuck outside to play during the smoke crisis created by the Carr and Mendocino fires. Kids breathe faster and have relatively more lung surface area than adults, which means that they're exposed to a higher dose of pollution per unit of weight. They're also closer to the ground where some pollutants settle, and they tend to be outside running, playing, and mouth breathing more than adults, which is how this little boy got into trouble. One other interesting thing about him is that his mom was pregnant during the Rim fire 5 years earlier. Prenatal exposure, it turns out, has many of the same effects on lungs and brain as exposure after birth. It also increases the odds of premature birth and low birth weight, which are both problems he had. Hurricanes and floods, which are also intensifying due to climate change, give us another example of how kids are being harmed. This is a little boy named Lucas, whose home was destroyed by Hurricane Harvey when he was 5 years old. He woke at night to the sound of his parents shouting, got out of bed to see what was going on, and fell in the dark into a foot of water that was covering his bedroom floor. Scientists would later say that Harvey's record rainfall was 3 times more likely and 15 times more intense because of climate change. All Lucas knows is what he lived through. This is a picture their neighbor took of them being rescued. The quote here, "I was scared for 1 trillion minutes," is something he said to his mom a few months later when talking about that night. The wall of their house was ripped open right there behind the trellis you can see in the background, from floor to ceiling by the flood, and water was pouring inside. His parents put him and his younger brother and sister up on furniture to try to keep them dry. But the water was rising fast and no one was responding to his parents' 911 calls. Lucas could see that his mom and dad were afraid. He heard his dad say that they had to leave or they wouldn't make it. They fled in the middle of the night through rushing water and pounding rain, pulling along a fence outside the picture here to the left, with the 3 kids on their parents' shoulders and in their arms, trying to hold on to the dog so she wouldn't get swept away. They made it to the neighbor's 2-story house where they eventually had to climb onto the roof and wait till morning in their wet clothes to be rescued. There wasn't room in the boat for Dad, so he was left behind and they weren't reunited for 2 days. Many of Lucas's experiences that night are known risk factors for PTSD, and months afterward, he began expressing fear of rain, water, and separation from his parents. He complained of not being able to stop thinking about that night, even when he tried, and was having frequent nightmares about it. Lucas's story demonstrates some of the risks children face in escalating natural disasters. First, just by being smaller and less mature, they're more at risk of physical harm. And because their brains are still forming, they face more risk of mental health and learning problems afterward. The trauma of a natural disaster can ripple across a family's financial and emotional life for years, especially in lower income families and marginalized and traumatized communities that have fewer resources to recover. We know that in young children, this type of chronic stress can literally mold the cerebral cortex and the body's stress response system, sometimes with lifelong effects. Globally, climate-related natural disasters have quadrupled in the last 50 years, meaning that they're a growing source of adverse child events and toxic stress. As this city knows well, children who were displaced by Hurricane Katrina had high rates of mental health and learning problems even years later. Fortunately for Lucas, some of the lessons learned in Katrina ultimately helped him through programs at Texas Children's Hospital for kids who were impacted by Harvey. But some natural disasters don't destroy buildings or generate the dramatic images of a hurricane or wildfire. This is Cody, who was 12 years old when his mother's boyfriend decided to take him on a hike to get out of the house. As his father told me, he was a good kid. He would have trusted an adult. And of course, we all encourage our patients to get outside every day. The only problem is that this was Phoenix in July, and it was 112 degrees. They hiked only a mile and had 2 liters of water, but Cody collapsed on the way back. EMTs had to run up the trail to bring him down and transport him to Phoenix Children's Hospital by helicopter. But his temperature on arrival was 107 degrees, and he didn't survive. And you might think, well, that's Phoenix. Of course, heat stroke is always a risk. But Cody's hike happened in the hottest month of the hottest year ever recorded on Earth. And it turns out that means something even in Phoenix, not only one of the hottest, but also one of the fastest warming cities in the country. A century ago, the temperature Cody experienced that day was rare. 100-degree days occur almost 6 weeks a year more often now in Phoenix than they did then. And heat-related fatalities in Phoenix have jumped 9-fold in the last 2 decades. Children are particularly vulnerable as temperatures climb because their bodies heat faster. They have a higher surface to volume ratio. Because they're growing, they produce more metabolic heat per kilogram. They have smaller, less productive sweat glands, so are less able to cool themselves. Newborns, children left in hot cars, teen athletes, especially football players, and obese kids are especially at risk, as are low-income children who may have less reliable access to air conditioning. Cody's father and stepmother formed a charity to honor Cody and try to prevent more heat deaths, especially in children. They give out bottled water with his picture during heat waves and support projects to prevent and treat heat stroke. The name of the organization, Codys Voice, comes from something his dad, Brian, says frequently. He had no voice in what happened to him. And I've thought of that often since he said it to me a few months after Cody passed away. Because really, that's true right now for every child we know. Children are uniquely vulnerable to the crisis they have been born into. They have the most at stake in the future, yet they can't vote and have no money. The youngest can't speak for themselves. For the last few decades, ever since the science became clear, the most powerful men on earth, running the most powerful industry ever known, have aligned themselves against the least powerful, the people who each of us in this room have committed our lives to help. It is the greatest moral and health crisis in human history. No wonder those who are old enough to understand and use their voice are trying to shame us into action, as Greta Thunberg did last month at the UN. As her generation rises in protest, trying to save their future, we pediatricians must stand with them. And you know, we're not generally known as an angry group. We're compassionate, kind people. But if we saw one of our patients being threatened or hurt by an adult, most of us would be angry and we'd go to that child's defense. We wouldn't sit and wait for someone else to do something. The AAP has been at the forefront of this issue, ringing the alarm that the climate crisis is a health crisis. And it's a health crisis first and foremost for children. Now we need to move from educating ourselves and parents about the health impacts of climate change to doing something about it. Because the technology that will save the most children in this century is not in the medical field at all. This is a sign I saw a child carrying at a climate march. Live as if our future matters. What does that mean for us as pediatricians? It means continuing to educate parents, yes. They trust us. And even in these divided times are likely to hear a message about climate change that's focused on their child's health. But we also need to give them ideas of what they can do. And we need to lead by example. We have to rally ourselves and parents to bend that carbon curve before it's too late. Here are the 4 biggest sources of greenhouse gases for most of us. There are hundreds of things we each could do about this list, and you may argue with what I've chosen, but here are just quick examples. You could go to your local utilities website and sign up to get all your electricity from renewable sources. Almost every utility in the country now offers this option, but they don't advertise it. With just a few clicks of your mouse, without doing anything structural to your house, and for just a few cents more per kilowatt hour, you could immediately reduce your own contribution to this problem. Make your next car electric and plug it into that green-powered house. And look, I know this is not an option for a lot of people right now, but 9 in 10 Americans own a car. For many of us, it's our biggest source of greenhouse gases. There is no climate modeling that shows we can keep using the internal combustion engine. There are currently 15 models available in the US, ranging from about $30,000 up. In the next 2 years, Volkswagen will be releasing 27 new models for the masses, and the other major automakers will soon be following. With just these first 2 steps, you can cut your carbon emissions by 60% or more. Eat fewer animal products, because animal agriculture is a big source of greenhouse gases. And if you've tried the plant-based meat substitutes, this isn't even much of a sacrifice anymore. You can insulate, adjust your thermostat by a couple of degrees, and make sure your air conditioner isn't leaking coolant, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And of course, take kids out to plant trees, which remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Divest from fossil fuels, vote, speak, and join other parents and physicians in this fight. And extend the fight to your hospitals and clinics. And until the federal government decides it cares about kids' futures, push your town and your state to do what they can to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. This room holds a lot of people, and if each of us just does one of these things, that carbon curve will be just a little bit lower. Finally, I just want to show you Shawny, the little girl who drew that picture on my title slide. Earlier this month, on the 2-year anniversary of the fire that took their neighborhood, she and her family moved into a rebuilt net zero carbon house powered by renewable energy. And I so wanted to end on that note. But then last week, another major fire broke out in her county. And yesterday, her family was evacuated again. There are 2 futures in front of us. We have the tools we need to give her the one she dreams of. We just all need to act. Thank you.